Am I on here, Mike? Sorry, all right. When I was in 5th grade, I was invited to go to a birthday party. It was one of the coolest birthday parties I've ever been to. We went to a place called Photon. How many of you guys know what Photon is? Okay, you have to be above a certain age to know what Photon is, because it was the great granddaddy of what you guys know as laser tag today. It was the first experience of its kind, and I'll never forget going to play Photon for the first time, because in my 5th grade mind, the only thing I had experienced that had to do with lasers was Star Wars. And so as we're riding with a group of guys in the van, I'm thinking, some of us aren't coming home. Because when you get shot with a laser in Star Wars, you die. And so I remember going, I was like, okay, this is going to be a really exciting time. So we go and we get in there and we are so geeked up and ready for this. And the first thing they do is they take all of us and cram us into this little room, and it gets really dark. And all of a sudden a metallic lady's head appears. And she says, "Welcome to Photon. You cannot handle this experience." And we collectively went, "We agree, we can't handle this experience." It was terrifying us. So she began to tell us stuff. And then they shoved us into another room where they began to put, where it seemed like a really ridiculous amount of like padding and gear on us. And we had these guns. And then they opened the door and they were like, "Go!" And we were like, "What? Nobody explained anything." We ran into this room and I immediately realized that one side of the room was the same color that was glowing on me. And so I ran to that side of the room, and all through the first round, I hid in a corner. And I came out, and everybody's going, "Oh man, that was awesome." I'm like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Nate, did you see me do this? I barrel rolled over this." And they're like, "Jason, what were you doing?" I was like, "I was on a whole nother level, guys. You don't understand." And then I realized that there was a scoreboard. And we had names, and most people's names were like the Warrior and the Hunter, and ours were like Dazed and Confused and Buttercup and like stuff like that. I'm looking at my name. My name's all the way at the bottom of the list. I had negative 100 points. I was like, how do you even do that? So the next game, I'm like, okay, I found out nobody dies from lasers in this game. And so I don't even care, man. I'm going out. I'm pulling out like every assassin movie you've ever seen. I'm just rolling in there. I don't even care about hiding. I'm shooting everybody. I don't care what color they got on. We're like, just killing everybody. And I was like, I got this. I come out, negative 1,000 points. Apparently you're not supposed to kill the people on your team, and you get really deducted heavily when you do. And so I'm like, I don't understand what's going on. But I noticed on my team there was one guy that was always at the top, and his name was the Hunter. And so I was trying to figure out who he was, and I noticed there was this one kid. To me, he was like a grown adult. I'm sure he was like in 8th grade. And he had his disciples around him. And I walked up and I was like, "Are you the Hunter?" And he was like, "Yes, I am." Buttercup. He's like, "Dude, you're killing our team." And I was like, "Dude, I understand. I've never played this before." And he goes, "Well, are you shooting the enemy modules?" What? He goes, "Dude, do you not know the point of the game?" It's like, the little metallic lady didn't say anything about modules. And he's like, "There's these things on the wall. When you go into enemy territory, you shoot those, and that's how you get points." And I was like, didn't get any of that. And so we go in this time. The door opens. Hunter enters. His posse. Buttercup on their heels. He's giving hand signals and doing weird stuff, and everybody's doing stuff, and they take me, and he's like, "Buttercup, shoot to that!" And I'm like, I come out, I get 1,000,000 points. It was like amazing. All my friends were like, "How'd you do that?" I'm like, "It's just, it's skill." And so, man, like, I'm just like bragging on me. And here's the thing, and here's why I tell you that story. It was a tragedy kind of to waste 2 rounds of laser tag not knowing the point of a game. But it's obviously a far greater tragedy to waste our life not understanding what the point of it is.
Amen.
And that's what we're getting into right now. We are going to get into this incredible thing called storytelling. And you can call it whatever you want. Really what this is about is evangelism. And see, here's the thing. We say that word in our culture anymore. People go, evangelism. Not me, not my gift, not doing it. Shut it down. But here's the problem with that, is that you can't disconnect any aspect of Christianity from the desire to share Christ and still call it Christianity.
That's right.
You go, well, we do missions. Yes, we do missions so that we can help people, and some people want to stop there. But that's not where it stops. We do missions so that we can help people, so that we can gain the opportunity there or help someone else gain the opportunity to share Christ with them. We do ministry here, and you go, I serve in this ministry. You might go, I serve in the nursery. How does that? Listen, you serve in the nursery because for like 1 hour out of that family's life, they can sit and maybe hear something that God needs to have them hear so that they can have a closer walk with Jesus Christ. You don't watch babies for the sake of watching babies. You watch babies so that other people can be fed the Word of God and alter their life.
Amen.
So you can't ever disconnect the evangelism of sharing the story of Christ from anything that we do. And when you hear evangelism, we immediately put on this lens of like, I've got to be a theology major to pull this off. No. You have to be a storyteller. Why is that such an important thing? Let me explain. We spend billions of dollars every year engaging in stories. We go to movies. We stream an entire series of stuff off Netflix in an evening. We read books. I don't know why. I just told you Netflix and movies exist. So, but some of you guys read books still, and that's cool. And even when we talk about stuff, we always tend to tell stories. It is born into us. It is built into us. As a matter of fact, God could have used any literary device He wanted to give us everything about Him. And what He chose to give us was a story. Jesus could have taught us in any way that He wanted to, but He more often than any other device He used parables. Jesus Christ taught in stories. Why? Because we all understand the aspects of a story. And every one of us have one to tell, and every one of us can tell one. And some of you guys, what you got to understand is, you may go, well, I don't like it because I'm a bad storyteller. Fix it! Because you have a story to tell. And that's what we're going to talk about in this series. I know some people that have already said to me, I know we're getting this storyteller series, but Jason, my story's boring. Wait for week 3. Because we're about to just rock the world of all the boring story people. We're going to give you an opportunity to live in something different. And so we are going to engage in stories. Also, this is a command of Scripture. The anchor reference verse that we're going to use for this series, you'll find on the front of your handout. It's 1 Peter 3:15. It says, always be prepared to tell or give a testimony. A testimony is your story, your God story. Always be prepared to give a testimony to everyone for the hope that you have. You don't get to choose whether or not you're a storyteller of God's story. If you're a Christian, it is a mandate for you. And so that's what we're going to dig into. And the way that we're going to dig into is we're going to look at it in the book of Exodus. Why are we going to choose to use the book of Exodus? For a couple of reasons. Number one, it's epic. I mean, the book of Exodus is one of the greatest stories ever. They've made multiple movies about it. You've seen it depicted by multiple people, but it's incredible. It's an incredible story. But the other reason, and these are in your notes, you can write this down, is the first one is that it's a microcosm of the story of God. Microcosm meaning that it drills down into the life of one person. And it tells a story with the most essential elements of storytelling. Here's what I mean. As Moses' story unfolds, you find a people, a status quo that has met some sort of oppression, some sort of a problem. A villain, in their case, a genocidal king who wants to end everything about them. And then an unlikely hero emerges from an unexpected place. And that unlikely hero begins to lead in a way that no one expected. And eventually leads them, in the case of the people of the story of Moses, he leads them to a place where eventually his initial movement towards leadership looks like it's going to end in utter and complete failure at the Red Sea. And then at the moment that our hero reaches his greatest limitations, the impossible happens. And freedom and liberation is granted to a people. It's a microcosm. You see that in the story of one guy, Moses, as God uses him. It's also a macrocosm of the story of God. It's the big picture. If you took all those same elements and said, the reason God tells us this story in Exodus is so that we will attach it to the big story of God. Because the big story of God, what's called the meta-narrative, the meta-narrative that plays out over all time and is playing out in your life, is that there were a people that are oppressed and have a problem, and that's us. Yes. Ephesians chapter 1 says that we were dead in our trespasses and sin. That you and I have a problem, and that is that we started off sinful. And that sin was not something that we could free ourselves from. We were, like the people of Israel, in bondage to that sin. And it was unbreakable for us. We could not escape it. And there's the villain. And the villain opposes and oppresses us at every turn. The villain wants to see us stop moving. And then an unlikely hero shows up in an unlikely way. Everyone's looking for a king. And somehow the King of Kings comes as a baby born in a manger. And he comes as a carpenter. None of that was anticipated. And this unlikely hero leads us to a place where everyone in the human world says in his first movement of leadership, it ends in a place where it goes, there's no hope left. It ends at the cross. And at the place where our character meets its ultimate limitation, the impossible happens. And a dead man walks out of a tomb and liberates his people. It's a microcosm and a macrocosm of the story of God. And so we're going to dive into the book of Exodus. And I want you to see these elements. I know this is going to sound crazy, but we're actually going to breeze through. And next week, you're going to dig a little more deeply into some specific text. But I'm going to kind of give you a flyby of the first 4 chapters of the book of Exodus. See, in chapters 1 and chapter 2, what you have is it seems like in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Exodus, it seems like God's not even present. Like he's there, but he's not active. You ever gone through life and you get up and you go to work and you do your stuff and you come home and you have dinner and you go to bed and you get up and you just go, I know God's here, but I just don't feel his presence right now. It just doesn't seem like he's active. That's what's happening, and it's actually written that way intentionally. The author here is writing the first 2 chapters to go, there's this mundane cycle of life where the activity of God seems to not be there. But then if you look into that text, you start to recognize certain things are happening that the people don't recognize. See, in Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, you get this verse. They multiplied greatly and they became extremely powerful and filled the land. While they're being oppressed, something's happening. Something's growing. Power is increasing. They don't recognize it, but it's occurring. And it actually uses this device where it says that they multiplied greatly. It actually uses the language of the book of Genesis where it says, go be fruitful and multiply. What he's saying right here is the people of God under oppression are doing exactly what they were called to do. And so they're fulfilling their purpose. They're multiplying in the land. If you read chapter 1, verse 20, it says, the Israelites continue to multiply. And let me give you some background to this. See, Pharaoh kept oppressing them and kept oppressing them and kept oppressing them. And he kept threatening to kill different groups of people. And every time they're oppressed, they increase even more. And so in verse 20, he says, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. See, in the mundane routine of life, something is stirring. Something is growing. There's a critical cause that is pulling something towards a resolution. And it's what makes the story compelling. It's like if you're a Harry Potter fan, and you were like, hey, I love Harry Potter, but if the story of Harry Potter was Harry Potter went to Hogwarts and he got his wizarding degree so that he could get a really good carnival job and do some really cool tricks. You'd be like, well, I'm not watching that movie. Because even while something was building, it's not building to anything special. If you're a fan of the Hunger Games, you would never have watched this or read the book if Katniss Everdeen's only goal was to get really good at a bow and arrow so that she could, get a really good, return on beaver pelts. Like you've been like, that's not that impressive. But in the middle of their mundane, they begin, in both cases, to go through normal mundane life, and something is building towards something significant. Israel has a cause. They are oppressed by a villain. They need freedom. Pharaoh goes so far in these first 2 chapters where he is so terrified of the increased power of the Israelite people that he declares that all of the Israelite baby boys are to be killed. And here's what happens, and we know the story. So Moses is born, and he's put into a basket that is filled with tar so that it doesn't leak, and it's sent down the river where it lands at the doorstep of Pharaoh himself, whose daughter brings the baby in, and Pharaoh raises the guy who's going to overthrow him by the power of God on his own dime. That's how amazing the story of God is. And I want you to not miss this. By the end of chapter 2, Israel is crying out for a rescuer. If you read the end of chapter 2 this week in your Connect group, you'll see literally they're like, God, send a rescuer, send a rescuer. And here's the part that landed on me, and I don't want you to miss this. That God began to raise up Moses in the beginning of chapter 2. Get that? He started raising up a rescuer before they ever asked for a rescue. Amen. That's such a cool thing. And then we reach chapter 3 and chapter 4. We just met a people. And we met their problem. And in chapter 3 and 4, we're going to be introduced to the rescuer and to the cause. We have one of the most, other than the cross, this is arguably the most iconic moment in Christian biblical history. You have Moses at the burning bush, where God reveals the cause in Exodus 3, verse 7 through 10. He says this. Then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. I love that. He's going, I know their pain. It is my compassion that is drawing this out. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile, spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. The land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivitites, and the Jebusites now live. Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me. And I've seen how harshly the Egyptians abused them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt. God says, Moses, we got a cause. I've an oppressed people. They're being hurt. They're being wounded. I'm going to show compassion to them. Here's the people. Here's the oppression. Here's the enemy. Guess what? You're going to be the guy. Go do it. Let's go, baby. Moses' response? You know, you'd think if that was the call of God, if God literally spoke to you and said, you're the guy, like at this point, you got to get this. It's not like I had a tingling in my heart during prayer meeting. This is a burning bush talking to you. You're going to be the guy. Lord, I have some concerns. And in this moment where God calls him to something great, Moses is consumed with his limitations. 5 different times, and this may resonate with some of you, God says, go do something great. And 5 different times in 5 different ways, God goes, you got the wrong guy. I mean, Moses goes, you got the wrong guy. So the Moses that we meet here is not the Moses that we typically see. Like when you watch the old Moses, you see Charlton Heston, you got that big, you get this guy right here. And Charlton, like by the time God calls Charlton Heston, you almost feel like Charlton Heston is pressing God to do something. Like he's like, Lord, we must go. I'm going to use you. Makes sense. If you watch the Bible miniseries, you met this guy. And this guy, when he shows up at the burning bush, he hears God speak to him, and he walks down the mountain, and he stands and looks dead at the camera, and he goes, I will free my people by the power of God. And it's terrifying the way he says it. You're like, yeah, like if I had a people, I'd release them to him. This guy looks intimidating. And then a couple of years ago, Christian Bale played Moses. And I just half expected Batman is playing Moses. Like you expected him to get to the Red Sea, and they're like, the sea is the problem. He's like, no problem. And one time happened. He's had a gadget for it. But that's not the Moses that we run into. We see a Moses that in chapter 3, verse 11, he says, who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? In chapter 4, verse 1, after God has done some convincing, he says this, what if they don't believe me or listen to me? What if they say, you're a liar? The Lord never appeared to you. What he's saying here, I want you to get this, is that Moses says, I have a credibility issue. See, Moses had attempted to liberate the Israelite people once before, on his own, and he failed. See, he saw somebody oppressing the Israelites, and it was an Egyptian soldier. And if you know the story of Moses, he runs over and goes, I'm going to take care of this. This is wrong. And he kills the Egyptian soldier, and he buries them in the sand. And by the next day, everybody knows, and it's the reason that Moses has to take off running. Everybody, listen, here's the basic story of where Moses lands when he gets to the burning bush. I'm a Hebrew, turned Egyptian, turned Hebrew, turned murderer. The Hebrews don't want me around. The Egyptians are trying to kill me. And I'm a sheep herder on the backside of nowhere. And they ain't even my sheep. Moses looks at what God is asking him. And he goes, God, here's the equation. Massive task plus limited resources equals impossible. He says, I have too many limitations. Anybody ever felt that way? Yeah. Like we can all find ourselves here. Let me give you some really great news about your limitations. He's right. You're right. Jason, I have limitations. Yes, you do. Didn't it feel like great news?
Amen.
See, our culture doesn't say that to us. Our culture won't tell you that you have limitations. All of us enter different rhythms at different times in our life. I remember when Zach was born, there was a popular kids show at the time called Blue's Clues. Now, if you don't know Blue's Clues, let me sum it up for you. Now, before I say this, if you're a Blue's Clues watcher, we were Blue's Clues purists. We only watch Steve episodes, okay? That other stuff's garbage. And so here's the deal. If you want to know the story of Blue's Clues is the story of a dog who hides stuff and makes clues throughout his house, and his owner, a college-age guy with no job and apparently no direction in life, decides to spend his days piecing together the clues that his dog left for him to get to the end. And at the end of it, he looks in the camera, and he and his dog go, with me and you and my dog Blue, we can do anything that we wanna do. No, you can't, Steve! Like in the one about your weight, you referenced that you're 120 pounds. Go be an NFL linebacker. You'll die, Steve. You'll die. Grow 2 feet. You can't, Steve. Teach your dog to talk. Can't, which is weird, because everything else in the show does. The alarm clock, the salt shaker, the cat next door. Everything else talks except the main character. Listen, the only way that song is true, that with me and you and our dog Blue, we can do anything we want to do, the only way that's true is if I put major limits on what I want to do. The only way that song is true is if I make the purposes of my life small that I can accomplish. Moses says what most of us say when he's presented with this grand story of God for his life. Moses says, but God, I don't think I can pull this off. And if we're being honest, most of us have reached that same place where we go, God, I don't think I can pull this off. And the cool part that I want you to see is that Moses is right, except that he misses one critical thing. And that is that he's talking to God. That's an important factor. You're declaring your limitations to God. Moses literally says, who am I to do this? And I love, listen, our culture, when somebody says, I have limitations, I can't do this, we go, yes, you can. Come on, buddy. But when God faces him right here, God doesn't say, when he goes, but who am I? God doesn't say, you're Moses, man, you can do anything. God says, I never thought you were going to pull this off. Well, you wrap your brain around that. But God, I can't. Yeah, I know. And I never expected that you would be able to. And that's because I want you to realize that at the end of your limitations, you get to run face to face with something more significant. He says, you can't do it, but I'm here. And you meet, when it comes to the story, the most powerful person, the author. the author of the story. And Moses doesn't really get who this is. And sometimes we don't. Moses is going to ask him a question that a lot of us at some point in our life ask. Well, who are you? You see that in Exodus 3:14. He says, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. Now there's a lot of confusion around this, and let's do a quick little Bible study element here because I want you to know this. He's not giving him his name in return. I am is not his name. His name is Yahweh. Now, both I am and the word Yahweh are rooted out of the same verb that means to be. Okay? But what he's saying is that I'm the one that exists. It'd be like this. If you called my house, or excuse me, I said that wrong. If I called my house and somebody answered, and I go, hey, this is Jason, I need to talk to Crystal. And they said, who is this? And I said, it's her husband. If their response was, which one? The one who is and was and will always be, like the only, I better be the only one. That's the answer. That's what Moses is getting right here. I am his response to the question that Moses just asked. He says, who are you? What God am I speaking to? Because in their culture, they had all kinds of gods. And God's response was, I'm the only real one. I'm the only God. That's who I am. You want to know who the author of this story is? I'm the only one out here. I wrote this story. And it's so important that we understand the author of the story, because the author is going to give us meaning. The author is the one that declares purpose in the story. Now, our culture will constantly tell us that we get to decide what our story is about. We get that all the time. Well, you decide what's important. You decide what you value. You decide where this is going. No. Listen, like, how can that even be possible? I show up in the story thousands of years into it starting, and I'm the author? That doesn't even make sense. We have to understand that we don't decide what the story is. The author does, and I cannot be the author. I need the author to tell me some things. I need the author to tell me the setting. I need the author to tell me the characters, the problem, and how it's solved. The author of the story dictates what's possible. If you're watching an X-Men movie, the author has determined that supernatural, superhuman things are possible. If you're watching Remember the Titans, you know that it is only what is plausible in the real world. Wolverine doesn't show up in Remember the Titans. If he did, that'd be a legit movie. But he doesn't, because that would change the rules of the story. The author determines all those things. The characters do not control the story. We need the author's information so that I can join my life to the story that the author is telling. And so the author holds all the power. The author dictates the story. The author decides the ability of the characters. And that is exactly what God chooses to show Moses in this moment. Because when Moses says, who are you? He goes, first, let's talk about this bush that's burning, but not being consumed. Because I want to demonstrate to you, Moses, I'm the God that has power over creation. Even what is natural to you, I can do anything. Amen. I have power over the created things. And then he turns his staff into a snake. A snake was the symbol of power for the people of Egypt. And he turns it back into a staff. He does so to demonstrate, I have the power over all governments, over all rule, over all things on this earth. There is no kingdom that is more powerful than mine. And then he asks Moses to stick his hand into his cloak, and he pulls it out, and it's covered with leprosy. And he puts it back in, and it goes away. He does so to demonstrate that he has power over life and death. He has demonstrated that the author of this story has power beyond anything Moses is capable of comprehending. He has power beyond the limits of this world. As a matter of fact, for you and I, God demonstrates this all the time. The Bible tells us that the sky declares the glory of God. That it says, and I love this, in Psalm 104 verse 2, it says that he wraps himself in light. Have you ever thought about that? Just like thought about that for a minute? Listen, our sun, it takes about 15 minutes for the sun to radiate as much energy as people use on this earth in all forms in a year. 15 minutes. As a matter of fact, the sun on its surface is so explosive that there is a bomb called the Tsar bomb. It's way bigger than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. It releases 1.2 megatons of explosive force when that bomb goes off. And a solar flare, essentially when the sun burps, it releases force of 100,000 megatons. Which means it's 100 times more powerful than the Tsar bomb. It is 8,000 times more powerful than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. That's when the sun burps. And the Bible says that God wraps himself in it, that he puts it on like pants. That is a declaration to you and me that we have a God that is powerful. So he's looking at Moses. He does all this and he says, Moses, I know you have limitations, but get this, Moses, I do not.
Amen. Yeah.
This is my story.
That's right.
Like, do you get that when we sing songs that we just say, this is my story? Whose perspective that's really from? It ain't yours. It's his.
Right.
It's his story. And I love this. After all of that explaining, after all the demonstration of power, you would think Moses would be the guy that went, I get it. Let's do this. But instead, Moses has his fifth complaint. Cool. Power over all things. Got it. I don't speak well. Now, there's a lot of different theologians that'll tell you different stuff, but in their culture, he was literally using the word for speech impediment. He's saying, I have a speech impediment. And I love this. And I know this is going to be something that some of you struggle with, but I want you to hear this. When Moses says, but I don't speak well, God doesn't go, come on, you can do it. I believe in you. Come on, Mel. No, he goes, I know. I made you that way. This may challenge some of you, but he goes on to say, who do you think made deaf people deaf? Who do you think made blind people blind? He takes credit for our limitations. What? Why? Why would he do that? God essentially looks back at Moses and says, I picked a shepherd on the backside of nowhere with a speech impediment because when you pull this off, people will say that has to be God. And that's the point.
Amen.
Amen.
So massive task plus limited resources equals impossible. But massive task plus limited resources plus God equals incredible. So when you wake up tomorrow and you go, man, I could never make a difference. I hope that you will preach God to your shortcomings and stop preaching your shortcomings to God.
Yes.
You look at your shortcomings and say, you don't control me. My God is more powerful than you are. My God is the one that can do stuff beyond my shortcomings. Your shortcomings, your limitations are designed to lead you to a point where you can't do it and you're forced to look upward.
Oh, amen.
That's the whole idea.
That's right.
So you don't get to wake up and go, well, I'm just a teenager. I'm just single. I'm just a bad speaker, or I'm too young, or I'm too old, or I don't have enough money. Listen, God can go farther than your limitations.
Yes.
Your limitations limit you. They don't limit him. Like God doesn't look at Mike Martin's life, and when he gets to the end of Mike Martin's capabilities, God doesn't go, well, sorry, Mike, wish we could have done more. I get people that ask me about this all the time. You want to look at this just the life of Crossroads, and some of you, I will tell you this, that how is it possible that we have a church that's grown 3 times its size and baptized over 150 people in the last 2 years? I can't explain that to you. Like I get people all the time, they'll ask us to come and speak to them and go, how did it happen? And we're like, I don't know. I can't explain that to you. I would have told you when we started, we didn't have the resources, we didn't have the bandwidth, we didn't have the leaders, we didn't have anything to pull that off. Crossroads is a part of saving young girls from sex trafficking in Bangalore, India. Like, we don't have the cash flow for that. That we just last couple of weeks gave school supplies to 427 kids, spent thousands of dollars to do so, and then turned around and spent thousands more on a celebration with our community. You would go, yeah, that seems not likely. We can call an unqualified pastor to come lead our church that is prone to mistakes. That seems like a bad choice. And yet God, in spite of all those limitations, said, yes, you're right. You couldn't do anything good with those things. But in me, we can do way more than you ever anticipated.
Amen.
And over the last year, we've had individual people that have been called to go to prison ministries. We've had individual people that have been called to adopt children that are not their own and bring them in and say, you will be my own. We've had people that have restored marriages that at one point seemed hopeless. See, you add God's power to the equation and you get a great story. If you want the power and the presence of God in your life, you had better start getting on board with His story for your life. A lot of people don't experience the power and presence of God in their life, and it's because they're too busy consumed with the story they want to tell. But if you'll ever tap into the story God wants to tell through you, that stuff will come rushing into reality for you. And so this morning there are two types of people in this room. One, there are some of you that you don't need to be a rescuer. You need to be rescued still. Like, you are a part of these Israelite people. You are a slave to your sin. You are bound by your sin, and you have never been freed. And I love what Hebrews chapter 3 says. Hebrews chapter 3 describes Jesus, and it says that Jesus is the better Moses. And that better Moses, that one that liberated a group of people out of Israel, the better Moses is coming to liberate all people. And He's coming for you.
Yes.
And so if you've never given your heart to Christ, if you've never committed your life to Christ, oh yeah, I mean, I've gone through the motions, but you still live in your agenda and your story, that's not surrender.
Right.
And surrender is necessary for salvation. And so if you need a rescue, the good news for you is the better Moses is coming after you. He loves you, and He has a better story to tell with your life. Then there's others of you in here, you clearly have a relationship with Christ, and you go, yeah, well, what's that mean for me, Jason? Can I just tell you this? Don't just herd sheep. Moses' life could have played out the rest of his life. He could have been a good guy and just herded sheep. And there's nothing wrong with herding sheep. But understand, listen, if you're the drinkingest, smokingest, running around on everybody kind of person in the world that uses all bad language and does all this kind of bad stuff, or if you're a person that's conservative and safe and you never do anything wrong, you don't drink, you don't smoke, you can, listen, on both ends of the extreme, you can miss the purpose of your life and waste it all.
That's right.
If you don't tie into the bigger story. And so don't just herd sheep. Don't just build buildings. Don't just work in HVAC. Don't just teach kids in your room. Don't just lay brick if that's your job. Don't just do spreadsheets. Don't just do those things. There's nothing wrong with those things, but if you're going to do them, leverage those things for the greater story. This church wouldn't exist if it weren't people that have those exact jobs that I just described weren't an active part of securing the mission of God through Crossroads.
Amen.
See, they do those things, but they don't stop there. They lean into something else. One day you're going to have grandkids, if you don't already, sitting on your lap. And they're going to say, tell us about your life, Granddad. And if you go, I got a good education, and we moved to the suburbs. They're not going to look at you and go, tell it again, Granddad. There's nothing wrong with getting a good education. Matter of fact, we need more wise people in this world. And there's nothing wrong with moving to the suburbs. Those people need Jesus.
Amen.
But if you just stop there, you've missed it.
Yeah.
You've got to roll that into something else. Some of you guys, you guys know that I love movies, I love stories, and one of my favorites is the Lord of the Rings. And there's a character in the Lord of the Rings, his name's Boromir. And he wants desperately for the story to be about him. He wants to be the king that's in charge of everything. And he wastes his entire life trying to get everyone else to acknowledge that he's the center of the story. And it's not until he's bleeding out in the woods, staring into the face of Aragorn, the true king, that he realized that he spent his whole life chasing the wrong thing. And he looks up into the face of the one true king and he says, I would have followed you to the gates of Mordor, my brother, my captain, my king. The problem? It's too late. You can waste a life trying to write your own story. And God doesn't want that for you. Moses could have just been a sheep herder on the backside of nowhere. But God has a bigger dream for your story than you do.